Okay, it is 12:10, and it gives me great joy to introduce Dan Peters to you today. Dan grew up in St. Louis, went to the University of Missouri, where he got a BS in chemistry, and somehow in 4 years in Mizzou, he never actually crossed the street to go eat ice cream at the ice cream store I started many years ago. After college, the wine bug bit, and he did harvest in California, Western Australia, and Tasmania before coming to Davis to do his master's degree. Post-master's, he is planning on going to Napa. I am very happy to introduce Dan and his master's project to you today. I just want to say I was really impressed with how amazingly quickly he pivoted from one project to another when COVID hit last year, and I will always remember that. Dan.
Thank you, Hildegard. That was very nice. Maybe one day I'll get over to that ice cream shop. But so maybe. Yeah, I'm Dan Peters. This is my thesis project. The title of this project is Survey Analysis of Consumer Actions at and Post-Purchase of Wine. I'm hoping you guys find this interesting because many of you were actually my guinea pigs for this project. So I'm just going to briefly go over what I'm going to be covering today. I think it's important to recognize the motivations for this study and why certain questions are being asked as opposed to others. So I'll cover this and some other brief details in the overview of the study and survey. Obviously, the majority of this talk is going to focus on the results of the study. And given the nature of a survey, there are numerous results I could have shown, but would take too long for this presentation and frankly might not be that intriguing. So I've decided to showcase some results that I deemed interesting and foundational to the research. And I've separated these sections into their respective categories. So we have red and white wine preference, wine consumption frequency, wine closure preference, and then regional comparisons. So those first three sections are basically an aggregation of all the overall results. And then I'll go into regional comparisons, which are comparing, as you might assume, differences between countries in various regions. And then at the end, I'll just summarize notable results and finish with some conclusions. So as with most people, my plans shifted with COVID-19 and the lockdowns. Sensory work is probably the least ideal field of study for this kind of situation. So I just bring this up though, in order to explain why the survey is addressing certain questions as opposed to others. So some of the questions that we were interested in the original research were, how would consumers perceive wines that had been opened previously? And are there significant sensory differences in wines that have been treated differently in terms of storage, wine preservation, et cetera, just different treatments? So when we were forming the survey, these questions that were intended to be addressed in the original research were prioritized. Of course, there's a wide range of questions that could have been asked, but these were the focus. Ultimately, there were other significant and foundational questions that were added as well for comparison. So it's important to keep in mind that obviously the wine consumer market is vast, and these can be comprised of several segments, and each of these segments can be distinctly unique in their characteristics, and it's crucial to understand these different consumer bases. By understanding these different consumer markets, the wine industry is more prepared and can readily address certain consumer demands. This is just one example, but this information can be utilized in numerous applications. So from the literature review that I've done, it seems that most survey analysis in the context of wine, at least, is utilizing consumer segmentation and is really helpful for breaking down a diverse market into more meaningful groups that can be compared. So surveys. I'd like to cover some benefits and detriments of conducting surveys. Online surveys are great for collecting large sets of data from a huge number of respondents that maybe would not be accounted for in other methods such as mail-in or telephone surveys. The program I utilized for conducting this was Qualtrics and was very easy to construct and distribute to people, which brings up my first point that distribution plays a key role. And in this study was mainly distributed through personal connections via email, social media posts, and was encouraged to be further disseminated. This presents a caveat in that, is this sampling indicative of the population? If not, this could lead to a coverage error. Also, in the way that you're distributing a survey, does this, automatically neglect other consumers that are not being addressed? This could lead to a non-response error. I think that this survey had a significant portion of people who were fairly familiar with wine, and maybe not as many who were not. But again, you're presented with this paradox where those who are not as familiar and as interested in wine, therefore may be less willing to participate in a wine survey. I do believe that this survey, though, had a wide exposure. Again, I'm trying to drive across this point that the market is diverse and that you need to try and account for these differences when appropriate. If a survey is not designed properly, you can significantly alter the respondents' answers, and therefore any results that are formed upon this are possibly unreliable. An example of this is actually one fault of the survey on the right, which is asking how long after opening a bottle of white wine until you typically dispose of it. So you can see some different options there for different time frames. That last option, other, is a text entry and allows the respondents to put in something that they deemed necessary. So you can see there's not really a never option, never throwing away or disposing of a bottle of wine. And I can tell you anecdotally from examining the data that there were actually some respondents who gave that answer under this other option. This would be an example of a response error. And if I had not put in that other option, you might have had participants skipping this question or maybe just putting an answer as in within 1 week. So essentially you want to provide respondents with enough options that is representative of the large majority of possibilities while not overcomplicating things. Giving too many possibilities will just spread out your answers and can lead to smaller individual observations and therefore a lower possibility of discerning any differences. I just wanted to briefly show the distribution of responses for the survey. So we received 1,152 responses. 994 of those were complete and usable. And the discrepancy there is just due to the formatting through Qualtrics, where if a respondent had started the survey, it would automatically record their responses 2 weeks from that point, regardless of whether they had actually finished the survey. So these were pitched. Surveys where the respondent had actually completed, but maybe have skipped a couple questions periodically were kept. And I just wanted to show this now, but I'll go into this in more detail, this regional comparison later in the talk. So this is getting into our first results section. I think this is one of the first fundamental questions of the survey. It was really simple, but actually formed a base to compare with many other questions in the survey. So you can see that there's actually a slightly higher percentage of people who would prefer red wine compared to white wine or being indifferent. You might expect these to be split evenly, so around 33%, but that was not the case. And other research has actually shown similar results with a higher proportion of consumers preferring red wine. So with this being the first contingency table, I'd like to briefly cover what we're looking at exactly. So this is showing the total responses for those who answered the wine preference question and what age group they were in. So we had 977 answers for people who had answered both questions. These are separated into their respective groups. And you can see, for example, the age group 21 to 29 years old, there were 159 who prefer red wine. So this contingency table is the observed values. This is what we saw. These are totals. I'm running a chi-square test, which is then comparing, let's say, this number with the column total, with the row total, as well as the overall total. And that will then give you your expected values. So you have your expected values, which is a separate table, and then it also computes a p-value. Pretty standard for this. We utilize an alpha level of 0.05. So I then step in and compare the observed values here with the expected values for those that were significant. So any dark darkly shaded cells were more than what we would have expected for that particular cell, and lighter shaded were less than. I'd also like to mention that any expected value less than 5 was ignored. So this table is the first indication of differences when considering age, showing that 21 to 29-year-olds were actually more likely to prefer red wine, while 30 to 39-year-olds were less likely. And you're also seeing that those with no preference were more likely to be 30 to 39 years old and less likely to be 20 to 29 years old. So this next slide that I'm going to show may give some more information as to why that may be the case. So you can see that most of the people from this survey would consider themselves to be somewhat knowledgeable about wine. You have 475 responses for somewhat knowledgeable and 322 for very knowledgeable. Keep in mind that we're not actually measuring how knowledgeable a respondent is about wine, and the participant is just indicating it themselves. So it appears that red wine and white wine drinkers may not consider themselves to be as knowledgeable as those with no preference. You still have the majority being somewhat knowledgeable, but there was a higher than expected count for those with no preference being very knowledgeable, and red wine being somewhat, white wine being not very, and not knowledgeable at all. So connecting this back with the table we saw in the last slide, it seems that this 30 to 39-year-old age group may be more knowledgeable about wine since they were more likely to not have a wine preference. And this is actually exactly what we observed. I haven't shown that particular table, but when comparing age and knowledgeability, the 30 to 39-year-old age group was more likely to be very knowledgeable, while the 20 to 29-year-old age group was more likely to be not very knowledgeable. This again is just demonstrating the differences that we are seeing among different age groups. And somewhat surprisingly, there were not many significant differences observed for older age groups. Some other quick results here. It was found that males tended to prefer red wine more than females, and females tended to prefer white wine more than males. And this has been shown in other research as well, where men have had significantly higher preferences for red wine than women. Somewhat surprisingly, there were not many educational differences seen for this question, but this was actually observed throughout the survey. And although some significant values were obtained periodically, some of these did not appear to have major underlying meaning. So here we're comparing, again, still the same question, red or white wine preference, and now comparing that with how frequently a consumer would drink wine. It's fairly simple, but another fundamental question, and we'll go into the consumption frequency question later as well. And you can see that the overwhelming majority drink wine weekly. These made up about half of the respondents or responses for each group. So you see 522 here from the total 994. So we're gaining more insight on the group that has no preference, where they were more likely to be daily consumers. Again, you still have most being weekly, but we did have a higher than expected count for those being daily consumers, as opposed to white wine leaning towards more monthly. And again, you still have most being weekly consumers. So at this point, we've now seen that those with no wine preference tend to be in the 30 to 39-year-old age group, consider themselves very knowledgeable about wine and are frequent consumers, as opposed to those who prefer red or white wine. So this table is just combining two questions together, which are addressing closure preferences. The question specifically asks if respondents were more likely to buy a white wine with a cork or a screw cap. So the top here, we have the white wine closure and red wine closure. Before I get into this table, I just wanted to give some percentages. For white wine, 57% were indifferent, 26% chose screw cap, and 17% chose cork. Much different results were observed for red wine closure. 47% chose cork, 43% were indifferent, and 10% chose screw cap. So this large increase for cork for red wine demonstrates a consumer's difference in expectation when it comes to white and red wine. And given the conventionality of bottling a red wine under cork, this result was expected. You can start to see a pattern in these tables where red wine consumers were more likely to prefer cork for both red and white wine. So you can see 93 responses here and 205 for red wine. Interestingly, white wine consumers were more likely to purchase a white wine with a screw cap. Although again, I'm bringing up this caveat that you do have most being indifferent. And the no preference group appears to be indifferent in both cases. And this may demonstrate that this highly knowledgeable consumer group is less biased by closure type. Other results from this section agreed with well-supported research that consumers are typically drinking their wine quite rapidly, most finished within 2 days. You can see that there is a small decrease going from white wine to red wine within the 24-hour time frame. This resulted in increases in percentages after the 2 days, so on the back end for red wine. An interesting association was observed where those that prefer red wine were more likely to finish a bottle of white wine within 1 week and vice versa. So this may actually demonstrate that consumers take longer to finish a bottle of wine that would not be their first preference. Again, some other results from this no preference group, we're seeing some niche knowledgeable tendencies, and this begins to form a hypothesis that this group is highly interactive with wine. This question was trying to address how interested respondents were in back label information. So this was essentially split into 4 questions, one pertaining to information on how the wine was made, and one pertaining to specific chemical information on pH, TA, etc. And then both questions were then asked for red and white wine. I combined the percentages here just because regardless of whether it was white or red wine, the percentages were similar, which is interesting in itself. You can see nearly half of the respondents were interested in information on how the wine was made. And unsurprisingly, those that were very knowledgeable about wine were more likely to be interested in information on how the wine was made. Regardless, those that were very knowledgeable about wine did not comprise 50% of the respondents. So there are many consumers who are interested in this information despite their wine knowledge. You can see a slight decrease in chemical data, which may demonstrate that consumers are not as interested in this type of information. These results have been supported in other research as well, which has shown that consumers rated both the front and back labels as important in their purchasing decisions. So shifting gears here to a different question, we've kind of seen this already, how frequently respondents drink wine. So we've seen that the majority of consumers are weekly consumers, and also that those that prefer red or white wine were not as knowledgeable about wine and were less likely to consume as frequently as those with no preference. So comparing wine consumption frequency here with closure preference, some expected results were obtained with the comparison between how frequently consumers drink wine and their closure preference. It seems that those who are less frequent drinkers may prefer screw cap for wine. Note that this was only significant for red wine though. A reason for this may be that those who are not drinking wine very frequently are not cellaring their wine and therefore not concerned with aging. There also may be an ease of consumption factor with a screw cap. Although we're not addressing price in this section, there is a price consideration to make where research has shown a lower price expectation for wines with screw cap. So therefore, those that are not drinking as frequently may not be spending as much on wine and thus gravitate towards a wine with a screw cap. So this is a lot to take in, but we're still addressing the same question on the left here, how frequently you drink wine. And then the 2 questions, question 21.2 and question 23 are just separated by whether it was white wine or red wine. The previous question to this question, these two questions were asking whether a respondent would store their wine in a cooled setting or about room temperature. So if they answered cooled setting, they were then shown these responses or these possibilities. So you can see we had about 994 responses total. You're having this decrease in white wine and red wine just because not as many are storing it in cooled setting. So you can see that those who are highly involved with wine and frequent consumers were more likely to store their wine in a wine refrigerator as opposed to those who do not drink as frequently. I have to admit that this question wasn't perfectly worded. It was asking how they stored it after opening, but there is still an observation that we would have expected. Most respondents are storing in a refrigerator, but there are higher than expected amounts for daily consumers. You can see this shift for less frequent consumers being more likely to store in a refrigerator. I haven't shown it here, but interestingly, there was a higher association seen with infrequent consumers storing their red wine at room temperature. So there may be a problematic association with those that aren't consuming wine as frequently, where they actually take longer to finish a bottle of wine and are not storing it in ideal wine temperature conditions, such as something like a wine refrigerator. So this table kind of connects with the statement on the last slide I just mentioned, where those that aren't drinking as frequently, you could argue, really need something like a wine refrigerator or wine preservation device. You can see that daily consumers were more likely to own all three of the wine preservation device options. Of course, the large majority of respondents did not own a wine preservation device. I'd just like to briefly mention as well that the reason the total on this slide is a bit higher is because this question allowed respondents to select multiple choices. Instead of asking whether a respondent owned a wine preservation device in general, this question was attempting to see if certain differences were observed within different wine preservation device owners. And this was actually observed in a few cases where some significant chi-square results may have demonstrated that VEN owners were a bit more considerate in their treatment of those that owned a VACUVIN. Some additional brief demographic results here as well. You can see the age and gender differences again. The age difference was expected. Those that are more frequently consuming would be more involved and knowledgeable. And as we've seen previously, the 21 to 29-year-old age group was seen as not as knowledgeable about wine. And some gender differences, males being more likely to be daily consumers, females being less likely to be daily consumers. This has been shown in other research as well. So as you may have surmised at this point, you can see the significance going diagonally across this table, with those being more frequent consumers leaning towards being more knowledgeable, while the less frequent consumers being maybe less knowledgeable about wine. I'd like to mention that this group, the high frequency consumer group, is of special importance for research purposes, as they are, intimately in tune with the product. So a lot of studies will actually focus specifically on those that are highly involved with the product, in this case, wine. So transitioning into our next section here, we're comparing wine closure preference. We've already seen that consumers who prefer red wine are more likely to prefer cork for both red and white wine. White wine consumers were more likely to purchase white wine with screw cap, and indifferent consumers were more likely to not have a closure preference. So I touched on the percentages earlier, but you can see that there is a much higher expectation to have a cork closure with a red wine. Only 10% were more likely to purchase a red wine with a screw cap. As stated previously, screw cap has been shown to negatively impact certain consumers' purchase intent. Other research, interestingly, has also shown that when rating wine attributes and importance, US consumers rated closure the most important, with price closely following. It also appears that most respondents are indifferent to white wine closure. So this table is specifically evaluating red wine for both questions. You have red wine closure preference compared to how the red wine is stored after opening. Clearly, storing in a refrigerator is the standard for most consumers, at least those that are storing in a cooled setting as opposed to room temperature. You can see, though, that those who prefer cork for red wine were more likely to store in a wine refrigerator. Surprisingly, there was an expectation for indifferent consumers to also display this result, since we've already shown that this indifferent consumer group tend to be very involved with wine and very knowledgeable. However, this is more specifically addressing the closure preference as opposed to red or white wine preference. And this is only accounting for those who stored red wine in a cooled setting after opening, which, as you can see from the total, is not the entire sample size. So you may have had a significant portion of indifferent consumers that are storing their wine at about room temperature. I bring up these first two bullet points to show an kind of an interesting roundabout way of possibly evaluating red and white wine consumers. So we saw that red wine consumers were more likely to prefer cork for both white and red wine. Other results also showed that those who prefer red wine were more likely to take longer to finish a bottle of white wine, and vice versa. Additionally, it was found that those who prefer red wine were more likely to finish their red wine within 24 hours or 2 days, and the same goes for white wine. So essentially, these first 2 points are really just showing that those who preferred cork for white wine were more likely to finish a bottle of red wine within 24 hours, likely because these were mostly red wine preferring consumers. The second bullet point is mostly white wine preferring consumers, and therefore may take longer to finish a bottle of red wine. Unsurprisingly, those that prefer screw cap were more likely to not own a wine preservation device. And I was somewhat surprised that there were not more significant demographic results for closure preference. There were some tendencies, but not many significant chi-square results. So moving onward to regional comparisons here, most of the results in this section are introducing price considerations, since these weren't compared in the overall results. And I'll get into that more on this slide. So we've seen this map previously already. It's just showing the responses respective to each country or region. So we have 241 from Europe, 142 from South Africa, etc. In the beginning of the survey, respondents were asked to select a currency that they are most familiar with. Therefore, someone residing in the US could select the euro if, let's say, they were from Spain and were more familiar with the euro. Familiarity with the currency was the purpose for designing the survey in this manner. But as a result, when sorting the responses into regions, they were sorted based on currency that they selected. So when originally designing the survey, there were certain regions that were expected simply due to personal connections that we had. Thus, this was not all encompassing. So there were 35 responses you can see floating off in the ocean here that were not accounted for. These were places like Canada and South America, which were forced into selecting the US dollar. So comparisons between those wouldn't really make any sense, given that the only characteristic that they had in common was that their currency wasn't shown. So when considering regional differences, these 35 responses were ignored. So these two questions asked respondents at what price point they believe to be inexpensive for a bottle of red and white wine. You can see on the left, we're addressing white wine, and red wine on the right. You could understand the motivation for asking a question such as this. We're attempting to see if certain regions consider wine prices differently. This data would suggest that that may be the case. Probably the most glaring result is from South Africa. There was a large percentage of people that would consider the $0 to $5 price point to be inexpensive. and this was the highest percentage for both red and white wine, and no other region was particularly close. This is the same data. I've just reformatted it into radar plots to draw more comparisons. From this data, it's clear that most consumers are purchasing wine within the $11 to $20 range. Of course, this varies by region, as there is not nearly as many responses from South Africa and Europe for this particular price range, but other studies have shown that about half of US and Australian consumers purchased wine within the $9 to $15 range, which actually is pretty accurate here. You can see the US point for $6 to $10 is almost at 60% for white wine. There's a decrease in going to red wine for lower price points and increase in higher price points for red wine. So this data is basically demonstrating how certain regions do perceive wines differently, and that inexpensiveness is relative. I'd like to bring up a caveat with the South African data, though. About 80% of the respondents from South Africa were 21 to 29 years old. This ties back into the point I made earlier about coverage error with surveys. Would this result be indicative of the population? I would be hesitant to conclude on this data given the lack of diversity in age, but I do think that this relationship would be observed in other research, just maybe not as pronounced. This figure is a slight variation from the previous questions and is simply asking what consumers will typically pay for a bottle of wine. White wine, as you might expect, is the golden color, red wine is the burgundy color. It's important to note that I have not shown the outliers here just because they would drastically dwarf the data and you essentially wouldn't be able to make out anything. So as we've already seen, there's a clear increase in price paid for red wine among every region. This is an interesting dynamic where consumers are expecting to pay more for red wine, are willing to pay more for red wine, that red wines may on average cost more, or a combination of all these factors. Though only 21 responses were received from Australia, the higher price paid by Australian consumers compared to US consumers has been observed in other research as well. And it's also clear to see that the South African data was fairly tight and did not show as much of a wide range as other regions. I wanted to point out that there appears to be an association with closure and price. The first bullet point would suggest that consumer perceptions and tendencies may change when increasing in price in the context of wine closures. These results were largely influenced by whether the wine was white or red, though. As I've showed previously, there seems to be a higher preference for cork for red wine. This may especially be the case at higher price ranges as well, where consumers are even more likely to expect an expensive red wine to have a cork. I've pieced together, again, some different significant chi-square results trying to demonstrate that there seems to be a trend in higher price paid for a wine and how quickly the wine is finished. I don't think that many people are going to be opening a bottle of Screaming Eagle and let it sit out for a week. So I think that these results make sense. You can see that at lower price ranges, respondents were more likely to finish a bottle within a week, while at higher price points, they were more likely to finish within 24 hours. So you can see the shift in price, and again, how this affects the consumer's tendencies and perceptions. I just wanted to briefly cover some other significant results that were anticipated. Essentially, at higher price points, we can expect consumers that are purchasing those wines to be highly involved with the wine. So more associated with interest in back label information, such as how the wine is made, more likely to own a wine preservation device, and consider themselves to be very knowledgeable. So kind of these niche segments that we're seeing. So due to the differences in sample sizes among the regions, there were not many differences that could be obtained. That doesn't necessarily mean that there are an abundance of differences that were just not observed. regardless, I wanted to show this interesting figure here, which goes back to one of the first questions of the survey, asking for respondents' wine preference. So Australia, China, and nearly Europe displayed a higher percentage for being indifferent. New Zealand showed a very high preference for white wine, as did Europe, though not nearly as pronounced. There were only 26 responses from New Zealand, so this may need to be refined, though it may be an accurate reflection of the country's reputation for white wine, especially Sauvignon Blanc. In 2020, Sauvignon Blanc made up nearly 74% of the total tonnage of wine grapes in New Zealand. So this may result in a cultural standard for drinking white wine, particularly Sauvignon Blanc. More studies would have to be conducted to affirm this conclusion, though. Also notable, South Africa and the US both showed a much higher preference for red wine. Other studies have shown that US consumers may show a higher preference for red wine than white wine. And again, I'd like to bring up that the far majority of South African respondents were 21 to 29 years old, and therefore may have heavily influenced these results, especially since we saw that the 21 to 29-year-old age group were more likely to prefer red wine. I thought this was a really interesting point. So with the US and South Africa both preferring red wine the most, an interesting difference in how they treat wine was observed. So a higher percentage of South African respondents preferred red wine cooler than room temperature. So you can see 48.59% here compared to 21.89% for the US. From a credible source, I believe you could probably guess who, they mentioned that in South Africa, it is not uncommon to have a bucket of ice served with your red wine when dining out at restaurants. So that was just really cool to see that connect with this research. So there are many individual conclusions that could have been made from the study. We saw how price influenced consumers' perceptions and habits. We observed different wine preferences among various regions. I guess I would say that the general conclusions that could be made are that surveys are extremely useful in assessing the wine consumer market, and a multitude of differences can be observed. And separating respondents into their respective groups based on similar characteristics is essential in analyzing this vast consumer base. It seems that one of the most key characteristics of a consumer is their wine knowledge, as this was highly associated with several tendencies and preferences throughout the survey. Some small differences were observed for different regions, though future work should analyze each region separately and obtain a larger set of responses in order to properly compare. Some acknowledgements. I'd like to thank Hildegard Heyman for being my advisor throughout this process and answering any obscure questions that I might have had along the way. It has been a pleasure working with her. Thank you to Annegret Cantu for her help as well in assisting me in setting up the survey and how to properly conduct it. Thank you to all my cohort for your support through this program. I'm really excited to see what everyone is up to after graduation in the industry. Thank you to the department faculty and staff for making this such a valuable and exciting experience. I really appreciate all of your help throughout this process. And for funding, I'd like to thank the International Wine and Food Society and the Wine Spectator. And with that, are there any questions?
Dan, you had mentioned early in the presentation that a lot of less educated consumers were really interested in seeing data on the back of the bottle. Like you had a picture showing pH and Brix and state. Is there any reason why you think they're interested? Do you think it could be something like they think the wine was made with more integrity, or they think it's more natural or organic if it's posted on the back label?
So that point I was making was that the very knowledgeable group was associated with being interested in this information, but we only observed, or we observed 50%. So the very knowledgeable no preference group did not comprise 50% of that. I didn't see a chi-square significant association with less knowledgeable people being highly interested in it. I just was trying to show the disparity between those, but it does seem that a lot of people are interested in this information. So it might just be someone who's unfamiliar with this or just trying to learn a bit more. And it does seem that that kind of specific chemical data may be out of touch and out of grasp for people who may not be as knowledgeable. Obviously, if they don't know much about wine, they have no idea what pH or TA means. Whereas that information on how the wine is made is a bit more easy to grasp. You can kind of understand on the process. So I think it's just stemming from a general interest in trying to learn more, regardless of the knowledgeability of a consumer.
Hey, I have a quick question. Well, first, congratulations and thank you for this presentation. It was very interesting material. I was surprised about, not surprised, but curious about your respondents from Europe. You pulled them together, but Europe is very diverse. So I was wondering if you had more information about which country or which part of Europe they came from.
Yeah, that was one factor that we were considering, whether to pool these different countries together, because of course they're all different countries with different cultures. They do display different tendencies. I think the purpose was was just to get a larger sample size in order to discern different differences. So we had a significant amount from Germany, I believe the Netherlands actually. So that in itself it may be problematic combining those, but again, the purpose was to try and get a larger sample size. You can see with the Australian consumers, that was only 21 responses. So when running the chi-square analysis, I wasn't able to get that many differences just because I just didn't have enough responses. So I think that was the reasoning behind that. But anecdotally, I can tell you there were some differences. There was another question that I didn't show here, but it asked respondents what wine variety that they enjoyed. And you could see some slight tendencies among different European groups. So Germany, I believe, was more, as you might expect, Riesling and varieties that are commonly grown and produced in that region, as opposed to others. I didn't cover that just because there was, this was just kind of anecdotal evidence and not significant. There were smaller sample sizes, as I said, but that was kind of the reasoning behind that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Also, I didn't remember if you asked questions about whether they were interested in the sensory information on the back label. You mentioned chemical and process.
Yeah, so nothing sensory related. We went with, so information on how the wine was made and information on specific chemical data. I would anticipate that those consumers would also be interested in just any kind of information. As I said before, there was other research that has shown that consumers highly rate both the front and back label and as important in their purchasing decisions. So I really think that anything on that back label is going to influence certain consumers. So sensory, if you mean, kind of like what sensory notes you might get, like plum or strawberries, I think certain consumers would be interested in that as well.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no further questions for Dan.
I have a comment, Hildegard.
Okay, Dario?
No, I really would like to thank you, Hildegard, and Dan for adjusting so successfully to the circumstances. I think this is a poster child of how can you reinvent your research when you cannot do what you plan. And, yeah.
I absolutely can never, and it was Dan who was the one who was willing to pivot and then proceeded to do something that was actually very nice. yeah, it's this, the congratulations should all go to Dan.
Yeah, that was an interesting moment where Hildegard and I are sitting there. What do we do now? And I said in the beginning of the presentation, that's probably the least ideal field of study, sensory science, for the circumstances given COVID. So.
And so we were looking at each other through Zoom going, and what do we do now? And this is what came from it. And I think this is a nice piece of work. We have a poster at ASEV, and I cannot be more proud of this man.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Dan.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, well done, Dan. Congratulations. See you next. Bye, guys.